Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to CEIMIA's Implementing AI Interoperability Multisectoral Perspectives webinar. The last in the three of our three-part interoperability webinar series. By way of introduction, CEIMIA is a nonprofit organization based in Montreal that mobilizes expertise and resources to promote the development and responsible use of AI for the benefit of humanity. This work is done through innovative, socially responsible, and high-impact applied AI projects, such as this one conducted with the support of Google.org on AI regulatory and technical interoperability. Our first webinar detailed the current state of AI governance, some of its challenges, and possible pathways to address those challenges. And regulatory and technical interoperability is just the intentional overlap or consistency between rules in the connection between one or more systems, services, platforms, infrastructure, etc. Emerged as one pathway that could address these challenges. We hosted a second webinar to understand how previous regulatory and technical interoperability efforts played out in other industries. Tried to answer questions about what the geopolitical climates were like during these efforts, what led to the effort's successes or failures, how and when did those interoperability interventions take place, and the clear objectives, incentives, and agreed upon approaches were found to be somewhat consistent across those previous efforts. Whereas geopolitical distrust between involved actors, lagging actors, fragmented approaches tended to lead to unsuccessful efforts. In the AI field, we are seeing geopolitical distrust increasing, fragmented national and international AI efforts, and incentives for compliance, and a few competing objectives around what AI governance ought to look like. During this webinar, you'll be hearing presentations from our three panelists that explore some of the ongoing AI interoperability efforts within and across sectors, how those efforts are being made, by whom, through which mechanisms or interventions, and any challenges that have been experienced during those efforts, and what might be able to be done to address them. And following these presentations, we'll have a brief discussion around the overarching themes of the presentations and then a Q&A with the audience to end things off. So today's panelists, there's three. Ashley Casavan, who is the Managing Director of the IAPP's AI Governance Center, where she serves as the primary thought leader and public voice for the IAPP on AI governance. She leads their AI and AIGC engagement efforts with industry leaders, senior policymakers, regulators, and international organizations to ensure AI governance is top of their mind when discussing AI's potential. Before this role, she held multiple positions in the public sector at the municipal and federal levels, where she developed the expertise in responsible AI standards, policy, open government, and data governance. She was the former Director of Data and Digital for the Government of Canada and led the development of the world's first national government policy for responsible AI. Kim Lucy, who is the Director of GRC Standards at Microsoft, where she has worked for over a decade. She began her career at EY performing info security auditing and consulting, and has practical experience implementing and auditing security and privacy standards for diverse organizations, and now works as part of Microsoft's corporate standards group, participating in ISO and IEC standards committees to help develop, draft, and revise international standards for AI, privacy, and security. And she is particularly interested in the alignment of international standards to regulatory and legal frameworks for emerging digital technologies such as AI, and how organizations can leverage these standards for regulatory compliance. And lastly is Mary Saunders, who is the Senior VP for Government Relations and Public Policy at the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, where she leads efforts to advocate for greater use of voluntary consensus standards and conformance programs by government agencies and broader participation by agency personnel in standards development. She works with ANSI members to create standardization related outreach programs for legislators and to increase understanding of the private sector standards community among agencies involved in trade and commerce issues. Mary is a key player at ANSI in fostering understanding among opinion leaders of the major role standards and conformance plays in the international and domestic marketplace. She has extensive federal government executive level experience and served in a variety of positions within the Department of Commerce prior to joining the ANSI staff, advising officials throughout the administration on policy and strategy as they relate to the federal government's role in standardization. So during these presentations, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will answer as many as we can after the presentations and discussions. To start, we'll be hearing from Mary, and then we'll be moving to Kim, and then lastly is Ashley. Mary, whenever you're ready, feel free to share your screen.
Great, thanks, Ben, and I will attempt to share my screen. Let's see. Hold on a second. There we go. Nope, hold on a second. All right. Of course, when I'm trying, I have an issue. Hold on a second.
All good. Just another note, we're going to be recording this webinar for dissemination purposes.
Okay, got it. It's fine. Trying to find, hold on a second. I had it up and now I lost it. Hold on a second. I could go without this, the slides if it's gonna be an issue. Here we go. Do you see something there?
Yes, all good.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm just going to go with the way it is. The different platforms are different sharing mechanisms. So anyway, thanks. Happy to be here. Happy to start out talking about standards. If you're talking about when you're talking about technical interoperability, certainly standards are critical to being able to enable that. They're the technical documents that enable systems to talk to one another, but they do a lot of other, engage in a lot of other, they're important in a lot of other areas as well. Did it move to the next slide?
You're good.
Okay, good. So, and certainly at the international level, standards are a common framework, not only for interoperability, but a lot of other issues surrounding AI, trustworthiness, risk management, actually governance in the context of how owning organizations govern their own AI implementations, and not to mention data privacy and other security issues. So I think an important point to make here is that standards are just documents. They need to be complemented by what we call appropriate conformity assessment, which is could be auditing, could be testing and certification, a variety of different ways to assure that standards are actually being implemented by organizations and in various contexts. And in addition, it's important that standards, which are tools, sit within appropriate legal and regulatory frameworks when that is the approach that's chosen by governments. So both government and industry have a significant interest in standards that achieve interoperability and help build trust across organizations and across markets. And as we all know, in the standard space, the standards with the widest effect are those that have broad stakeholder input. Their process follows the principles of openness, transparency, balance of interest, consensus, and coherence is a very important concept in the international space, because standards that are accepted globally are certainly much more effective than those that are applied either nationally or regionally or in other contexts. Just briefly, I'll go over the benefits to business. I mentioned we're going to talk about interoperability, but there are a lot of other benefits to business when processes rely on the underpinning of standards that have been developed by a broad range of stakeholders. Certainly trust and confidence, a very important set of concepts in the AI space. It helps strengthen reputation and brand recognition for businesses that comply with internationally accepted standards. From the commercial perspective, we're always interested in market access, reducing trade barriers and expanding access to markets. And certainly standards have a significant role in driving, supporting innovation and growth as well. So all good. This slide provides a very brief overview of key standards development activities. There's a lot going on in the AI space, and there has been for quite some time. The major global technical committee, ISO-IEC, Joint Technical Committee 1, Subcommittee 42 on Artificial Intelligence was actually established in 2017, started work in 2018. So they have a pretty large portfolio of what we call foundational or cross-cutting standards that support implementation of AI systems in generally and in particular vertical areas. IEEE, the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, was also early to the table, particularly in the area of ethics of AI, and a treaty organization, ITU, technical telecommunications or technical standards arm of the ITU has a broad range of study groups that are looking at AI as it is applied in telecommunications, internet communications, as well as your classic communications. And then, as I said, because there's a lot going on in terms of governments looking at AI interoperability and AI governance, there are active regional efforts. I'm going to focus specifically on the EU, because EU legislation is driving rapid standards development at the regional level by a joint technical committee of CEN and CENELEC, and also the European Telecommunications Standards Institute. So they're moving trying to move quickly at the direction of the European Commission in response to the EU AI Act and related laws. And then, of course, we have a lot of activity in the various sectors, in the financial sector, healthcare, automotive, aerospace, and so on and so forth. We like to think that those sector or vertical implementations will be supported by the cross-cutting standards and will benefit from those cross-cutting standards. So just a little bit about government approaches. I talked a little bit about the EU AI Act, which is explicitly driving regional standards activities in Europe at the direction of the Commission, which has mandated that the regional standards organizations develop standards that support that act. China has taken a very government-directed approach with a clear strategy for developing AI standards and implementation within China. And then we have the US, where the approach has been largely industry-driven and government-supported. The latest iteration of the policy at the US federal level is the US AI Action Plan, which speaks to standards as well as exporting the full technology stack of AI and a variety of other relevant topics. But we do not have a specific AI legislation or regulation. We are using the existing legal and regulatory framework to manage AI risks and AI opportunities within the US context. And then briefly in closing, I just wanted to note some issues. Despite the robust body of work at the international level, particularly coming out of ISO and IEC, but also IEEE, we see a risk of fragmented AI standards efforts, which will not facilitate interoperability or greater market access. There are different drivers for the AI standards efforts. I mentioned a few of them, different priorities and different participants. This is creating a little bit of stress in the system and has the potential to lead to lack of coherence across the national, regional, and various objectives, incentives, and approaches. I think it's something I would look forward to discussing in more detail as we move through the panel discussions. But despite a robust effort to develop international standards, there are quite a few drivers that are pulling toward market fragmentation and also standards fragmentation that I think we need to be aware of. So I will stop there and pass the baton.
Thank you. Kim, feel free to share your screen and begin your presentation whenever you'd like.
All right, let me make sure I can share. Let me know if you can see that.
Yes, I can.
All right. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Are you seeing that bigger and not in the presenter view?
It's in the presenter view.
Oh. Let's see. I have, sorry, one thing. I have two screens connected and sometimes that messes it up.
Okay, if you just present it like this, if easier.
It should, let's see, how's that?
Good. That's good.
Yep. All right.
Yep.
Yeah, when I connect to my second screen, sometimes it can't figure
It's
out
wonky.
which one it wants to use. So hi everyone, thanks for having me here. As Benjamin mentioned earlier, my name is Kim Lucy. I work at Microsoft. I work on our corporate standards team. So I'm probably going to talk a little bit about standards as Mary did, but I also want to give some of the industry and private sector perspective with the theme of implementing AI interoperability. And I'm going to talk about a few themes. Of course, this is not, every topic related to AI interoperability that is currently ongoing. but just a few of the things that are kind of most top of mind recently. So with that, probably the most kind of biggest theme that is coming up over and over again in the past, I don't know, 6 months to a year, for me personally and within our team, I would say, as I talk to customers, as I talk to others in our industry, as I talk to my colleagues who do the same job in other companies like ours, is this concept of shared responsibility models for AI. And when I talk about shared responsibility models, what I mean is who has responsibility for what roles. So if you think about cloud computing, which has now been around for a couple of decades, and you think about, say, software as a service. And when you use a software as a service, and taking Microsoft as an example, say M365 as an enterprise, there are certain things that your organization is responsible for, and certain things that Microsoft as an organization who's providing the services responsible for. We cannot control the strength of your passwords. However, we can provide the ability for you to set strong passwords. And so there's this shared responsibility where a developer or a provider of a service can give a customer or a user and the ability to do something, but it's also a responsibility of the customer or the user to enable that feature, to use that feature appropriately. And so this is, when I talk about the shared responsibility, this is kind of an example of what I'm talking about. For AI, this is something that is still really being kind of hashed out and developed. So when we talk about AI roles, we're thinking about things like developers, providers, users of AI. And there's really a need in the market for better definition of those roles and responsibilities and architecture. So, you can have developers, you can have deployers, you can have users, you can have other things such as providers of the data that's used to train the model. You can have, maybe people who refine and tune the model for a company before that they actually implement it. And so there are, I think, roles that need to be both defined and refined that we haven't quite gotten to yet. And the way that that really ties into interoperability is that it's going to help us enable cross-platform and cross-border collaboration, which is really necessary for both the technical and regulatory interoperability. We're not fully going to be able to, use AI systems and products to their fullest capabilities unless we define these roles appropriately, unless we can understand contractually what we need to put in place, unless we can understand, even for regulators as they write the regulations, how do they phrase in regulations such that legal liability is appropriately assigned? And so this concept of shared responsibility is one that is, I think, really key and really critical to the discussion of interoperability overall, and one that is still, we're in the early days of really defining that. I think it's easy for The you know, when we talk about cloud computing too, it's been around long enough that it's easy to point to that and say, well, that's easy, that we have this, and you have SaaS and PaaS and IaaS, and this is who does that, and this is who does that. For AI, it's going to be a lot more complex because of the number of roles that are involved, the different types of dependencies and the complexity of those dependencies. And so I think that the time that we need to spend thinking about that is going to take a lot longer, and it's just something that we haven't figured out yet. So that's probably the biggest thing that's top of my mind lately. The next one, which I think that we've touched on a little bit in what Mary said, is the difference between the needs of vertical industries and horizontal AI. So if you think of AI as a general purpose technology, and the needs of vertical industries, this is particularly comes out when you look at regulatory regimes, regulatory requirements. So one of the areas that in the private sector and in the industry that I'm in is that we really see this is approaches to risk. So we see in thinking of the EU AI Act in particular, the approach to risk as a product safety framework versus harms and benefits outcomes. There's a real difference between thinking from the perspective of a vertical industry in a very specific sector and a very specific application, such as a car or a medical device or a child's toy, where you have a safety framework that you have to assess based on a tangible product. And then the concept of AI as a general purpose technology, akin to something like, electricity, when electricity was invented, and now it's become this general purpose thing that is part of our daily lives and applied to literally everything that we use. And it is more of a harm and benefit outcome approach to risk. And so there's this difference in how risk is approached. And that has, there's a lot of things that I could say about that, because, it's led to differences in how the industry has been able to work with regulators and with the bodies creating harmonized standards in the EU for the EU AI Act. It's a very different way of being able to talk about how AI as a kind of horizontal and general purpose technology can be used, versus how vertical industries are regulated and how their technologies and products are used. There's a lot going on right now, even in the discussions of, and this is a very Eurocentric view, but within the entire regulatory framework of the EU, which is based on something called the new legislative framework, which is actually being revised right now, how something like AI as a horizontal and a general purpose technology can fit into something that is very much product-based and based on a product safety framework, how that NLF may be revised to actually account for something like AI, and the horizontal nature of that. So what have those differences in the needs between the vertical industries and the kind of horizontal needs of AI as a general purpose technology led to. I think that it's leading to different and more novel avenues of collaboration and problem solving. So it's not necessarily that, you know, the problems aren't being solved or everyone's throwing up their hands and saying that we can't work together. Um, but there are shared regulatory requirements, and, you know, whether people like it or not, we have to solve these. And so this is where things like industry associations, consortia come in, and standards play a very important role when the regulatory frameworks and the harmonized standards aren't necessarily playing nicely with the international standards. There are some other things that can be done to utilize those standards in different ways, such as through industry associations and consortia. And so I think that likely we will start to see more of that in the absence of real progress within harmonized standards being created and widely adopted by both the vertical and horizontal industries. And then the last one that is really on our mind and the industry that we're in is the interoperability of conformity assessment ecosystems. And when I talk about this topic, what I'm really pointing at is a theme that I touched on a little bit in the prior point, and that is the need to reconcile the conformity assessment for tangible products. So again, that very tangible product safety framework focused conformity assessment ecosystem. And when we talk about conformity assessment, that's the whole ecosystem of thinking about how you test and certify a product. And within the regulatory framework, particularly in the EU, it has historically, again, been focused very much on tangible products. Obviously, AI is not a tangible product, and it has some very unique and different challenges as opposed to tangible products, particularly the fact that it is constantly changing, it's constantly learning. You can't take it to a lab, plug it in, test it, put a label on it, say it's certified. So we need to update the ecosystem of conformity assessment to be able to include this concept of a digital product and to allow testing mechanisms to first develop testing mechanisms and then allow testing mechanisms for something like AI to be able to operate within the broader conformity assessment ecosystem that includes tangible products. Because not only does, you know, do AI systems need to be assessed and certified, but AI systems are going to be and already are within tangible products. If you think about things like medical devices and cars, they're already intangible products. So not only do they need to be certified, you know, on their own, but they need to be certified as part of and to be interoperable with the broader conformity assessment ecosystem of the existing tangible products. The good news is there's significant work being done in this space within SC42. There's a joint working group between them and Casco, which is the conformity assessment group within ISO AEC. There's a new standard on guidelines on conformity assessment schemes for AI systems. IECEE, which is a group within IEC that does conformity assessment schemes, is doing a pilot study on conformity assessment schemes for AI systems and medical devices. So there's starting to be work in this area. But again, historically, it has really been about tangible products, and there's still a lot of work to do in this space. So again, those are kind of the three biggest things that are top of mind for me, that are taking up the majority of my daily work and keeping me up at night. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Kim. Ashley, free to share screen.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much for including me in this. I am also very, very pleased that I am going last because I do think that I hope that my presentation can build off of what has already been shared. As mentioned, I'm Ashley Kesman. I am leading the AI Governance Center efforts at IAPP. I just wanted to give a very quick overview of what IAPP is and what we're doing. And again, I think that it really builds on what was shared previously by Mary and by Kim. So we're a global nonprofit organization. We're politically neutral, and we've had the fortune of being around for about 25 years, or no, this is the 25th year, not about 25 years. And in that time, the majority of that has been focused on privacy professionals. So that's where the name came from. Now we're just known as IAPP. But this ends up becoming important, so I just wanted to share this context with everyone. And I joined the organization when there was the launch of the AI Governance Center in 2023. And so my efforts are focused on AI governance, but it would be remiss if we didn't talk about interoperability without talking about different types of skills that professionals need, including those from pre-existing professions. And so it's been a really interesting journey that IAPP has taken this on. And since launching the AI Governance Center, there's also been a cybersecurity law center that's been launched as well, to recognize that there's a lot that we can learn and take from with cybersecurity. And I know we'll get to some of the questions after, but I think that even as Craig Schenk had asked in one of the questions, there's a lot that we can learn from cloud cybersecurity, I think cloud shared responsibility work. So we'll get to that in more detail, but it's just, I guess, foreshadowing to share what we're thinking about as this broader digital governance set of standards, requirements, and then the people that are needed to do that work. And so what I've been focused on in this effort, and as you heard from my background from Ben earlier, I've had a great opportunity to think through how do you govern and manage AI systems from a government perspective. So the organization that's setting the rules, in my case, this was for how does government use AI systems, and then look at it with work that I've done in the past with Ben and with Kim in terms of the systems themselves. And so a lot of the different standards that Mary and Kim were speaking about related to both, and I'll share this a little bit more, the organization and the system level standards. And then now what I'm working on is people standards that are attributed to that. And so that's how I've been thinking about this question of interoperability, to get to this challenge that both Mary and Kim spoke to in terms of just even understanding what are we needing to apply these standards to, or think about interoperability through which lens. I think that the work that Standard High does in terms of creating an indice for use and adoption of AI is really interesting. They call it a AI vibrancy, or this is the image from their AI vibrancy index. But it's just to share a visual for the challenge that I think both presentations have already articulated, which is that when we're talking about applying standardization or interoperability, what are we even trying to apply that to? And in what region are we trying to apply that to? Because the development and adoption use in each region is different. The set of rules associated with that use and the motivations to increase adoption and incentive structures are really different within each of those regions. And so as a result, there's been several different efforts by various different organizations and collectives of organizations, including ANAB, ANSI, labs like Microsoft, other government organizations, CENELEC. We talked about the EUAI Act earlier, Mary did, and rules that are stemming from the EUAI Act. There's separate standards operations through CENELEC that are looking to set those standards. I think it's important to break down what we're talking about in relation to that, and recognizing that when we have a desire to have an interoperability, that we need to be thinking about not only the sectoral verticals, but even the types of standards or rules. And so as I was just mentioning earlier, like to think about that in terms of the organization. And so when we have some of the standards that were mentioned earlier, the NIST AI-RMF, not a standard, but a framework, ISO 42001, these are looking at the organizational aspect. And then getting into technology, when we're looking at conformity assessment schemes, really thinking about what at a system level for each of those uses, like software as a medical device, standards should already be applied. And because of the challenge, again, that's already been articulated by Mary and Kim, we don't have that taxonomy. And the question that's being asked by Craig and others in the chat, which is, in absence of having a clear understanding of the various different uses, it really requires people to be able to have some degree of proficiency and competency to navigate through all of that. And so how we've been approaching or thinking about defining what that means, or how these different actors and stakeholders can work with one another in order to, in a harmonized fashion, apply or in an interoperable way, speak to different stakeholders. We work to map out a AI governance ecosystem. And so just identifying who are the various different actors and stakeholders. In addition to that, this is just the diagram from it. We have a table that also then articulates the relationship, which is what those red boxes are seeking to do, is articulate the relationship between the various different stakeholders. And that became really important for me to try and understand, what does it mean to be interoperable? And again, I feel like I'm just going to say the same thing over and over again, but and who is that being applied to? So what rules are we trying to what rules are we trying to create, and for who, and then who is the one that's applying them? And often we talk about AI governance being, or I'm just going to talk about this in the framework of AI governance, because it's the broader subset of applying standards, or the various different frameworks that Kim was speaking to, which is really understanding where are the different, or where are the different stakeholders? Where are they coming from? And so when we speak about AI governance as being a team sport, part of the challenge that I've seen is that we're often not playing the same sport. And so we don't have the same, when we bring everybody together, we don't have the same nomenclature, we don't have the same rules, we don't have the same objectives all of the time. And so understanding those different stakeholders or those different actors, again, became step one for how we're trying to define this within the IAPP context. So what we've done is we've put together certification for professionals, and there is a taxonomy or a schema that supports this. So it's called the AI Governance Professional Certification. You can see it on our website. I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail on it, just more the background of how we're thinking about this. But we have globally trained, there's a training that complements it, over 15,000 people, and there's 10,000 people who have purchased the exam, not necessarily taken it, but it's just statistics to show you the interest and some of the adoption rates associated with this so far. We worked through or against an ISO accreditation process for this, which again, I think goes back to just even thinking about the different layers of interoperability, something that's really important when, again, trying to understand to one of Kim's points around, I made notes, and so I'm trying to reference them because there's so many things to say here. Based on what Kim said, but the this distinction between product safety, conformity assessment versus harms and benefits, it's really interesting because even as the geopolitical conversations have changed since a lot of us have been working in this, again, broader remit of AI governance, that's been a shift as well. And so even something like the debates that are going on within each of the member states within the European Union on who their supervisory authorities are going to be, or the regulators are going to be for the oversight of the EU AI Act, is something that's really, again, another layer of this interoperability challenge that exists. And so what we've tried to do with the AIGP schema is to say, okay, professional, you're going to be the one that's going to have to be the translator or the interpreter across all of these various different teams, if you will, as per my previous sports analogy. I'm not really a sports person, so I hope I got that right, but I think at a high level that makes sense. So all that to say is that in getting to this and in trying to understand this, I've been working towards thinking through an AI governance professional skills framework or a skills competence. And so really thought through, okay, what are the different types of tools, resources, community that these professionals need? And then what are the different skills identification that would come from those needs? And so I've broken it down into these subsets. And again, I'm gonna fly through a lot of this information really quickly, so happy to share more in any of the questions. But again, it's to get to the understanding of how can people with all of those different skills and all of those different backgrounds and then all of those different types of resource needs that we as a professional association typically provide, how can we synthesize all of that and really try and build this out for these various different professionals who, again, might be speaking these different languages and then need to work together as a cohesive team to apply them to the various different standards and frameworks that Kim and Mary have both presented on. And so that's a really significant challenge that I don't think I put enough stake in when I was working on those organizational rules or the system specific standards, because it does require a lot of interpretation and translation, but also it's not so simple when there's rules that are being created that say things like make sure you have policies and make sure that you have governance bodies with all of these different stakeholders from across the organization. That's not always a really clean and simple and easy thing to do. And again, that's why it's been really interesting to build out this AI governance effort as part of an entity that's been serving privacy professionals for so long, and then now cybersecurity, et cetera, is because I get to see firsthand some of those tensions that exist between policy discussions within the privacy community versus some of those kind of more product safety or harms and benefits conversations that Kim was articulating earlier, that typically are coming up within the AI governance ecosystem more. So I wanted to share how we're thinking, or I'm thinking through this, but I think some other resources that are really interesting and useful to have a look at, that other governments and civil society organizations are also looking at, are the following. And this is the first one that I'll point out, since we've already talked about the importance of having formal rules through the EU AI Act, which is certainly one of a kind at the moment, is that there's a lot of guidance that is going to come out that either has come out or will come out to complement the EU AI Act. And that one of the things that, because it's a requirement that's already been enacted, Article 4 of the EU AI Act is an AI literacy requirement. And so part of the supplemental guidance that they've put out is a living repository for AI literacy practices. You can find it on the EU Commission's website. And it demonstrates some of, again, the previous information that I showed on the slides, albeit very quickly, but just articulating that the need for upskilling people and across these various different types of units, either on technical knowledge or governance knowledge, to be able to appropriately oversee these systems. And a big piece of that is then how are you going to apply or implement these standards in a way that is cohesive with other requirements. Oops, sorry. I went... Just when I thought that I had a seamless presentation, I put my notepad on my keyboard. Apologies.
Ashley?
I will, as I bring it back up. So that's been something that I have found to be a really, really useful resource. Okay, great. And then the Tech UK, I'll put my notebook over there. Tech UK has been put out a report, and there's a workshop coming up next week to map the responsible AI profession. And again, I think similar themes to what I've been sharing here is trying to understand what are those skills that are needed, how are they being applied, how do we go beyond saying everybody needs to be in the room, it's a team sport, how do people actually communicate and work and function with one another? And a piece of that, and to build on some of the work that Ben and I have done together with a collaborator, Graham Auld at Carleton, has been on AI assurance. And so the UK government has really released earlier this week a trusted third-party AI assurance roadmap. And this gets to what Kim was talking about interoperability on conformity assessment schemes. A big piece of conformity assessment schemes is the person or the people that are going to be capable of applying that. And so it's one thing to have some interoperability and consistency across those schemes. It's another thing to have a workforce that can then actually perform that. And I wanted to pull it up. I will put the right language in the chat, but it has just been confirmed to me that we're able to share this, but the Government of Canada, through Standard Council of Canada, has actually just accredited the first body that can provide accreditation against the 42001. And so we're starting to see this market evolve, and that's some of what this trusted third-party AI assurance roadmap in the UK looks like, is how to build out that market, and upskilling is a big component of that. And finally, I think just to, again, build on some of what Mary and Kim already shared, there's efforts that are away in various different regions, including the UK and Canada, in terms of having standardization hubs. And a big piece of the conversation there is not just to document and have a way to look up various different standards, which is what both of these do, but to try and create efforts to prioritize standards development or standards implementation through some of these things, like having accreditation for certain types of conformity assessments, like I just shared, in prioritized areas. Part of the challenge here, again, to go back to the reliance on politics, is that based on different types of administrations, we have different prioritization efforts. But one thing that I will say is what's been interesting to see on the geopolitical level is that even though the rules might exist or not exist or be different, and the political rhetoric around the desire for rules around AI might be different, I think there is a strong interest in having there be standards. And so even though it is quite a disparate activity at the moment, I think that we're still seeing that recognition that there's a reliance on standards. And so through that, I think the work that Sensenelec is doing to advance AI standards, ISO, etc., will hopefully be something that can be then adopted and implemented in these other nations as well. I'm going to leave it there, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have on this.
Everyone. So I'm just going to get right into the discussion questions, if that's all right. So it was sort of pointed out across all of these presentations that there's this fragmentation or incoherence challenge, whether that be in standardization efforts or the conformity assessment ecosystem or the professional certification world. So how do you guys see this challenge being addressed, if at all, and by whom? Mary, you seem sort of happy to think about it and answer this.
That's a really tough one. I mean, each Kim and Ashley and I have all referred to the geopolitical tensions, and generally speaking, and this applies to AI also, there's a more competitive aspect to the global situation than there was, say, 10 years ago. And so there's a more of a, from the government perspective, I think more so from the private sector perspective, there's a, we win, you lose. Somebody's got to win, and that's not conducive to reaching general agreement on principles. I do think the work the OECD has done is very helpful in terms of pulling together, OECD members and a variety of other members in talking about principles, as long as one can convince the governments to continue to apply those principles. And then I think because it's difficult, the private sector plays a significant role in encouraging governments worldwide to look more toward collaboration and cooperation. There are areas of competition that can be built on top of on top of platforms, but competing on the whole technology stack is a little bit is not the best way to move forward. It's a little bit sort of missing the bigger picture. So I think the more discussion we can have amongst governments in the OECD, in the Group of Seven, and various other iterations, those can continue to push toward collaboration. It's not an easy problem to fix. I think, as both Ashley and Kim mentioned, I think the issue is not so much the standards, there's fragmentation in standards, but this is a whole new way of assessing conformity of systems, and it requires, development of new tools and new approaches and experts that can actually understand these systems and how they are applied in various areas. And so you need those three legs. You need the standards, you need the new conformity assessment practices to build trust in the systems, and you need qualified officials that understand the systems. That takes time.
Yeah, maybe I would just add that I think there needs to be this taxonomy or framework of AI use, whatever you want to call it, but it goes to the question that Craig asked in the chat, and I think all of us have spoken to, which is without having some sort of common set of not just use cases, but I think it can be, I've put a lot of thought into this, yet and keep saying I want to do this, but anyway, it's not a small thing to take on. And I think to your question, it's unclear who should take that on, and therefore would have the authoritativeness associated with it. And so I do think that remains one of the biggest issues. That there's been many, I would say, academic, more research-based efforts on this front. But I would agree. I think that OECD is the home for something like this. But even then, it's not and how the governance works to get something through to create that, and then therefore for countries to follow is not clear to me that that's something that they will ultimately take on. Like, there's not this equivalent of the European Cloud Council. I think that in Craig's example that exists, that's taking that on. And so either way, though, what you need, so the question remains, who should do it, I think is still TBD. And even then with OECD, I guess why I'm struggling with this is that the winds shift in terms of what each of these organizations do. On one hand, there's so many different types of organizations that are seeking to do aspects of AI governance, but there's not kind of one overarching body that's responsible or charged with these different types of tasks. And so I think that's been part of the challenge, and then why you see even not redundant efforts so much, but regional efforts that are doing similar things, like with the example that I provided with the AI Standards Hub in the UK and Canada. So yeah, we still have that, I guess, regional variation. Sorry. So that's that's part of the challenge. And then the second piece of it, where I think there's more of a clear answer in terms of understanding this taxonomy, is, and where we've seen a lot of efforts related to or academic efforts that I think are contributing to a solution, would be things like we can leverage an existing taxonomy of industries. We have Article 3 of the EU AI Act and Article 2 to be able to identify different types of use cases. The OECD's put out a taxonomy of uses, but it's not articulated in the same way that we're articulating it. And so then from kind of bringing some of those things together, you could have a taxonomy of use cases. You see with the AI incident database, another great example. If people aren't following it, it's they have a taxonomy in there of where incidents exist and occur. And so then mapping the various different rules and standards that already apply within that articulation of, here are the industries, here are the use cases. And we've started to see, sorry, I missed a layer in there. We've started to see some industry associations or international organizations like the World Health Organization come forward with a framework for, this is how AI is being used in healthcare. We see this with finance as well. And so we can start to map some of these things together based on our pre-existing understanding of how the marketplace and the economy works. And so I think just that outstanding question of who's responsible for doing that in an authoritative way that the standards world will reference remains a challenge. And sorry, the very last thing I will say on this that I think adds to the mix that or the challenge that we haven't really articulated, is that how Senate Senelec decided to approach standardization around the EU-AI Act was related to the requirements, not versus the uses in the way that we're talking about this. And so I think that they're looking at that right now, and Kim and Mary might have updates that I don't on it. But I think that that initial approach to creating standards for requirements that were one-size-fits-all requirements led us down this path, is my personal opinion on that.
Again, Mary, any additional thoughts? Things you wanted to add? No? Okay. So a little bit more in the same vein, it was also brought up that there's these like vertical and horizontal challenges within this like fragmentation and incoherence issue, like across governments, but also within different industries and different sectors. I'm curious if there's like a more specific way you see some of these things being addressed within your particular industries. Like, is there a way in which the private sector more broadly can address some of these vertical or horizontal issues, or governments or standard setting bodies? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can try to answer your question. I think that one of the things that we can and what we're trying to do is look more to the vertical industries and listen more to the vertical industries and use examples and lessons from the vertical industries to apply to what we're doing. So one of the things that we've been looking at, for example, is within the like machinery manufacturing industry. They have something called the Machinery Directive, and I think that's what it's called. And it's this whole set of regulations and standards in response to the regulations where, and I have someone else on my team who's the expert in this, so I'm probably going to butcher the explanation, where they have been able to essentially respond to the regulation with kind of an approach that allows you to kind of stack onto one another the various standards that you need. So if you're creating machinery for, I don't know, some kind of specific industry, and you're doing these horizontal standards, but then you need a set of other ones, you can stack those on top of it. And if you're doing machinery in this other type of very niche industry, you can choose these other ones. So everyone has a set of horizontal ones, and then, you can kind of pick and choose which makes sense for your specific needs. And they went through a similar kind of problem as we're facing right now, where it was like they had all of these requirements that they all had to comply with, but they didn't all have the same needs. And it was like, well, how are we going to all comply with this thing that we have to comply with? But all of us have very specific needs that we need met. And they got together in, various consortia and things, and came up with a solution where they have the baseline horizontal requirements, and then they have their individual things that they can pick and choose from to stack on top of that. And so I think it's an example that we've found from a vertical industry, but that also applies to the problem that we're facing. And so, and obviously we have customers in that industry. And so talking with them and learning like, okay, well, how did you work through this problem? How did you work with one another? What types of venues did you come together in and create these standards to be able to actually comply with the regulations that you are complying with. And that's been really helpful for us to kind of, you know, approach the problem in different ways when maybe, at least for now, the existing, we're not a tangible product. AI is not a tangible product. We can't comply with the new legislative framework exactly how it's written, right? We can't take it to a lab and get a label put on it, and we have to kind of come up with different ways to collaborate and different ways to solve a problem. And so turning to these vertical industries and looking at lessons that they have learned and things that they have gone through, and then thinking about, okay, well, how can we apply that a little bit out of the box to the problem that we're facing, has actually been really helpful and has let us, kind of identify with the current problem a little bit more, because that's essentially what we're facing is like, how do you engage this very horizontal thing with all of these vertical things? Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah. Yeah. I was just sort of curious if there was yeah, I don't know. Thank you. Mary, Ashley?
Well, maybe just building a little bit on Kim's comments and it's coming at it from a general perspective. Low risk applications or lower risk applications of AI are perhaps a good place to start. And I've seen that in vertical. So in the healthcare sector is early adopter of AI assisted diagnosis, AI assisted billing, the furthest forward they've gotten is in the radiology area, because you've got a human in the loop again. I mean, the AI, large language models or the learning models help, whittle down what the radiologist has to look at and make some, potential determinations about whether the read is correct or not. So, but you have a human in the loop at the end. The human makes the decision. I think there's a lot more trust that customers, patients in this case, have if you've got a human in the loop at the end, and AI is really increasing efficiency. In the automotive sector, the same thing. I mean, there's as I think Kim mentioned, or maybe it was Ashley. I mean, there've been software. There's been software in cars. I had a hybrid car for many years, 11 years. I mean, the turn signals, the automatic braking systems, those are all software enabled, and consumers understand that, and or at least trust what's going on. Where you get into when you get into autonomous vehicles, what we've found helpful, and maybe it works in other areas, are what we call, they don't like this term, but regulatory sandboxes. So if regulators allow new technologies to be tested out in a controlled environment before they move into the full regulatory framework, and so you can assess the risk and make a more practical determination, that's helpful. So I guess a general way of putting this, early collaboration between regulators and product and system and process producers to really get a more practical sense of what the risks are and how they can be controlled. And then starting with low risk applications. I could go on. I mean, the machinery sector, they've been using AI within the confines of the manufacturing floor for a long time. When you move it outside, perhaps there's a higher risk. But just looking at demonstrated implementation where safe procedures have been able to be applied, and looking at managing risk in that context, and then broadening out the envelope.
Ashley, Kim, anything to add? Okay. So it was also mentioned that like conformity assessments, assurances, audits, they have this seemingly large role to play in all this. And there is this proliferation, a whole bunch of standards in this area now. So is there some way of finding a way to not have a whole bunch of auditors or assessors that need training against all of these different standards? Like, aren't we just going to arrive at the same fragmentation and incoherence problem? Rather than it being standards, now people who have to assure, audit, or perform conformity assessments against said standards? Curious. Sorry. Go ahead. that was the question. I'm just sort of curious, like what you
I'm
see the
happy
role of like
to-
professional. Oh, sorry. You just
I'm
said
happy to
my bad.
start. But I still feel like Mary and Kim will probably have more to say about this. So we ran a workshop, Ben and Graham, who I previously mentioned, last December, and we had the example from one of the Government of Canada departments that was using AI systems in a pilot function. And so they had gone into, well, what do we need to assure or ensure these systems are working effectively? And so that's kind of the closest that I've seen to a system application of looking at what are the requirements or what are the skills that an AI auditor, for lack of a better way of putting it, would need. And I think that what they had shared that has stuck with me is that they had 5 people with different skill sets that were required to create this assurance around the system based on the different rules that they had put forward. And again, thinking about the industry requirements that were already in place, the existing policies from the Government of Canada that needed to be applied, and then some of the best practices that they had come up with or mitigation measures that they had come up with in advance of deploying the system. And so and because this was a high-risk system, because it was something that had already had an audit report against it, I think that they created a lot of diligence in what they were in their approach. So I'll just put those caveats behind it if you're thinking like, oh, 5 people are excessive. But I think what it goes to show is that even when we're talking about having an AI auditor or doing these assurance mechanisms, we're getting into what are you trying to assure, and therefore having some consistency across those schemas might be useful, but you have different skill sets of people that have different types of knowledge. In this case, because it's an HR and pay system, they needed to have people that understood the AI technology itself. They needed people that understood the pay functioning, and they needed people that understood the HR functions and processes. What they did say though was, given that that was their first time, that's why they had those 5 people. But if they were to be able to not only create a consistent set of rules that then were always being applied to their HR and pay use cases, which I think could be extended across the industry, not just the Government of Canada's application of this, because it's a common use case, that they in the future could see having less people that would need to audit it, because they would be able to then upskill or train one of those auditors with the various different knowledge that they would need to have, both subject matter expert wise and also technology wise, to perform that function. And part of that workshop, there was the Ben, I'll get the name wrong, but Auditing Association of Canada, the CPAs. Thanks. Yeah. Chartered professional. Okay, I'm just going to keep doing this wrong anyway. The point is that people that know how to do auditing for financial practices and where we have kind of those most significant skills, and they're looking at this question, which I think is really interesting. And speaking of interoperability, the Canadian CPAs are working with the American CPAs on shared research and doing a report on this effort to address this exact question. And so I do think that it's starting, but again, this goes back to the reliance on having that taxonomy or understanding of how we're using AI to be able to identify and then apply those skills and apply that training.
I think that we also have to consider that the field is so new that, you know, that's one of the reasons that we're seeing a proliferation is that people are trying to do the cash grab. And 2, that, you know, I'm kind of thinking back to like my a long time ago. We don't have to do the math, but when I was at Ernst and Young and we were doing, you know, kind of our very first cloud audits, and how many people we would have to put on cloud audits, because it was like sitting in rooms with engineers, and you would have to like walk through and they would have to explain to you like, okay, well, here's the system architecture, and every company that you went to, which of course in the Seattle area is like two main companies, um you know, it was different, right? And like it was so complex and kind of, you know, cobbled together. And this was 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago. And it was, you know, there was not any kind of like, there was some consistency to it, but it was such a new technology that it was kind of starting from scratch each time you did a, you know, infrastructure as a service at one company and a SaaS service at a different company, because it was such a new thing. Now when companies get audited on their cloud services, it's like, all right, well, you know, everything's not exactly the same, but like it's fairly standardized. So I think that over time, I mean, and I'm not saying that AI is exactly the same as cloud. It's a fairly complex thing, but I think that what we will see over time is that, you know, the way that it is built and created is going to be standardized. It's going to become simplified both in terms of how systems are put together, as well as in terms of how people understand it. I mean, you know, my parents who are in their 70s are like vaguely familiar with how cloud computing works at this point. I think that just the general public is going to, AI is going to become part of the lexicon and understanding how it works. And so it's going to become, from a conformity assessment perspective, not as much of a lift in terms of auditing. You know, it's probably going to take 5 or 10 years. And at the same time, you're going to see this proliferation of schemes and you know, I don't want to say lesser standards, but like, you know, standards that are maybe not like ISO standards, as standards that are not as well known, maybe they're going to fall out of popularity, because people are just, you know, they're not going to be attractive to consumers and to enterprise customers, because they're not going to have that mark of trustworthiness.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, where it's messy now because people are trying different approaches, and some will work better than others. So, and I agree with that. I think we'll move toward more standardized approach. I will say there's a tension, as there is always, between when to regulate and how to regulate, and when not, and the different approaches. We've taken a different approach in the US than is being taken in the EU. Will produce results at some point in time. I was talking to an industry practitioner in Europe who was saying the EU AI Act puts a wet blanket over innovation in AI. So there's a possibility of regulating too soon with too strict a top-down, you know, risk-averse approach. Actually, you know, makes innovation much more difficult. So I don't know what the balance is, but I think you're right, Kim. It's messy now, but the better approaches will win out. And I know Casco and the conformity assessment side, they're really trying very hard to, how do you move from product certification, where the product doesn't change after you certify it, until you have a new updated edition which affects safety somehow, to this a product which inherently, it's a product or a service which is enabled by software, enabled by an AI algorithm, it changes by definition, and the issue you have to address is, when do those changes require a new certification? When are they just improvements and again, your roles and responsibilities, so you can trust the owner of the process or the system or the product to make those updates? And when do you need to call in a new certification? They're new issues.
Were there any other final thoughts on that question? Yeah, and then I'm just cognizant of the time. There's 10 minutes left. So is there anything that any of you wanted to add, clarify, or add to before we move to the audience Q&A? No. Okay. So we have, I know Craig's first question, I think, was answered by Ashley. Was that when you were chatting? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we've addressed it. Maybe Craig feels otherwise.
And then there's a question on asking for a bit more clarification on what vertical and horizontal industries mean. Just hoping you guys can maybe clarify that a little.
Starting to write in the chat, so I'm happy to do it. I think this is what I was trying to share earlier with what the challenge is that we need to follow one taxonomy for how we're defining different types of industries. And so that's when we're talking about vertical, so health, finance, education, manufacturing, etc. ISO has a list of these already. Like, there's one to follow. Again, as an AI governance or as an AI ecosystem, we need to understand what's that list of industries that we're following. And then what we're talking about in terms of horizontal are the various different applications or uses of. And so that, for me, becomes a bit of a challenge, because you can think about that in terms of and you asked this question later on, which I also just tried to respond to, which is, you can think of application in terms of region, where is it being applied? You can think of the type of technology, and I think, just to build on something that Kim just shared on that, it's the AI governance or the AI ecosystem is relatively new. I feel like we've now been saying that for like 10 years. So at some point we have to say, like, it's not new anymore. But I think part of that, why we say it's new, is because it's been changing so much. And so even when we started talking about the need for standards, we were talking about them in relation to automated decision-making systems. And now we're talking about the need for them for agentic AI. And so and there's generative AI, and like, there's multiple phases to that. And so I think that it's relatively new. I'll put an asterisk on that, but it's also just changing so rapidly. And so again, region bucket, technology bucket, like, what type of AI are we even talking about? And then there's the use. And so let's use generative AI. It could be used in all of those different verticals that I spoke about earlier. And so there's the reason why there's a need to clarify this is because there could be common standards across some of those uses, across some of those regions, across some of those verticals that would make sense. But that need for understanding that matrix, if you will, for lack of, I like to think in spreadsheets. And so that kind of understanding is really what we're talking about. That is the gap right now.
Yeah. Mary, Kim, did you want to add anything, or is that the answer was good? Okay. And then we have one other question from Craig. I'm not going to read it all, but I'll try to summarize the gist. So he pointed out that in the network security standards space, that there was a lot of work done around ensuring that there was mapping exercises or crosswalks at various standard setting bodies like the CSA group or NIST and in the private sector, which sort of helped contribute to better interoperability. And he was, I think, generally asking, like, where might we see similar efforts for moving towards AI interoperability, and who may do that. So he points out that, like, NIST and OECD has done some of this stuff already, but if there was anything else that ought to be done, and where you see that sort of happening.
Yeah, so he had two questions. One was about reference architecture, and I can say there is no universal reference architecture for AI, but SC42 has done some work on reference architectures for particular application areas like knowledge engineering and other areas. And then with respect to crosswalks, yeah, those are great. And NIST, the NIST AI risk management framework is similar but different than the ISO IEC 42001, which is the risk management standard that was most recently published. Now there has been, NIST is doing a crosswalk between, and I like to think, because my NIST colleagues tell me this is true, that similar to the cybersecurity framework being moved into the formal standards arena into JTC1, they'll do the same with the AI risk management framework as well and move it into SC42. So there's greater tangible coherence and consistency between the two documents. They're different. One's a framework, the others are standard. The other's standard, but just greater consistency. So at least from the NIST perspective, that's still their modus operandi in the AI standard space, is to move their work that's done in response to executive orders into the formal standards arena as soon as possible.
I feel like that question was slightly pointed at me. I do a lot of that work within my team at Microsoft on a, private sector basis, I guess. So my team under me that works on mapping stuff, we actually did the 42001 to NIST AI RMF mapping and submitted that. So the one that's publicly available was done by our team and then validated by the US national body before it was submitted. And we really formed our team that works on that work because we've seen the value of doing the mappings and analysis between, and it's not just for AI, we do it across all of the standards that we work on. And we've seen the value of, the mapping work between regulations and standards and other types of frameworks, one standard and another standard, both in terms of being able to see where the standards might be missing something, as well as where we might have regulatory requirements that are overlapping, and we can say, hey, we're already doing standards that cover these things, and this regulation is saying basically the same thing as this regulation. Of course, that's just me and two other people on my team who are working on that, and that's not really sustainable and scalable on a wider scale. But I have talked to other people within the broader standards and governance, risk, and compliance space who do similar work. Insights, which is the group that manages the US national body for ISO IEC, has started doing more of that work in partnership with NIST. So when we did ISO IEC 42005, which is the impact assessment standard, one of our people in the US national body took on that mapping work. And so kind of trying to advocate for people to pick up that. So it's, I think the more that people can publicly comment on how helpful that is, the more we can at least get throughout standards in the US national body and maybe like the Canadian national body, volunteers to help with that type of work.
Thank you. So I'm going to wrap up, but before I do that, did anybody have any last minute thoughts, anything like that? No? Okay. So just to wrap up, this webinar's recording will be uploaded to YouTube in the coming weeks. and the project's final report will be publicly published around November. CEIMIA's social media pages will post about the upcoming recording and the final report's publication. You can find more information about the project on CEIMIA's website. And thank you, Ashley, Kim, and Mary, for coming, presenting, discussing this stuff. I appreciate the time. I know you're all very busy people. Google.org for supporting this project, and my CEIMIA colleagues for helping organize all this, and to the audience for taking the time out of your day to come and listen. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and week.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Thanks for having
much.
me.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.